Hello everyone and welcome to part 3 of the UnitedPOP midterm, part 2 of the UnitedPOP midterm assignment. Today we're going to be taking a look at how we can use our finished low poly model to create a high poly model and use that to create some normals that we can then bake onto our low poly model again. This is a process that we do in order to get basically extra lighting detail on the instead of on the polygon level but on the pixel level. So we're gonna bake out a normal map for our low poly model that we can use to then make it prettier basically, or make it nicer to look at. Now before we get started, you might have noticed that the audio quality has changed a little bit and the resolution of the recording has also changed, and that's because I'm actually not at home right now with my usual setup, but I'm away from home because we had a corona infection in my family, and so we had to make sure that some of us separated so we didn't infect any more people. So having said that, let's dive right in and let's take a look at how we can create a high poly model. Now when we take a look at the head of my X here, for instance, you can see that I took the liberty of making some edges harder and some edges softer. So you can already start sort of preparing for the high and low poly workflow by simply going in, selecting some edges, like for instance, let's say if I select these edges right here, and if you hold down Shift right mouse button, there's an option that says soften harden edges, and then if you do soften harden, you will leave it up to Maya to sort of figure it out based on how sharp that edge is, whether or not it should be soft or hard. But you can also do it manually. So right now I have it softened. If I go harden edge, you can see it, and now all of a sudden we get this very clear line over here. So if you're ever modeling and you're just extruding some things and creating some extra geometry, and then you zoom out and all of a sudden you see a whole bunch of these edges that look ugly, you know that you have to go in and start softening some of those edges. So again, Shift right mouse button, and then I can go soften edge. Now we can see that edge is gone and it looks a lot nicer. Now I sort of use that to my advantage a little bit to create a couple of hard edges where there aren't very pronounced bends in the geometry. So you can see, for instance, this edge right here is hardened, but there's not a whole lot of degree difference between those two polygons, but that's just because I was going for that look, because I wanted to have a sharper edge over there. And I did the same down here and down here. So just know that before you even start smoothing your model, before you even start working in the high poly modeling phase, you can sort of go in and decide which edges you want to have softened and which edges you want to have hardened. Now before we commit to smoothing our model, one very useful tool we can use is the smooth preview. So if you select your model and you press 3 on your keyboard, you'll see that Maya will sort of display what your model would look like if you were to smooth it. Now what smoothing basically does is it tries to average out the distance and the what would you call the bend or the degree difference between polygons. So for instance, we have these two polygons right here, and in our high poly or in our low poly they have this corner right here, and if we then press our smooth preview, you can see that Maya sort of tries to round off that edge over there. So now that you know that, we can use that information to sort of take a look at our model and decide where we want to place our hard edges and where we want to have Maya smooth our model over. Because smoothing, it generally looks kind of good, but if you have a model like this one, which has some very pronounced hard edges, then you can run into some trouble. And let me show you what I mean by that. So if I again enable my smooth preview, you can see that there's some weird things going on with my model right now. You can see that Maya doesn't really treat these edges that nicely. It tries to sort of round off this point right here, and I don't want that. It starts to create some strange lighting artifacts on these edges over here, and as well as down here. If we take a look, it tries to do the same, and it just doesn't look very good. As well as it just looks like an axe that's made out of rubber or something, and we don't want that. So how can we solve that? Well, let me hide my low poly model for a second, and let's take a look at my high poly model. So my high poly model looks like this, and as you can see, it's still pretty clear that I have those edges over here and over there, as well as the sort of cutting edge of my axe, and I have my nice little pointed out top of my axe head over here. So how did I achieve that? Well, if we zoom in a little bit, and I am again switching between smooth and unsmooth preview by pressing 1 and 3 on my keyboard. You can also press 2, which is kind of interesting. Then you get sort of like this overlaying geometry that shows you what your high poly or your smooth and your unsmooth mesh, how much they differentiate in terms of size, and yeah, so that can be useful as well. But for now, let's take a look at the low poly version, or the unsmooth version. As you can see, what I did, for instance, over here, is I created a support edge for the top of my cutting edge of my axe. And basically what this does is, because it reduces the distance between these two edges, Maya will treat this polygon right here in the middle the same as this one over here. So it smooths them equally, but because this one is much tighter and much narrower than this one, the smoothing effect will be sort of neglected. So it'll be it'll be smooth less, basically, because the amount of smoothing that's going on is equal for both of these polygons, but of course this one is a lot bigger. So sort of imagine as if you were, well, it sort of works the same as how we discussed the different resolutions for texture maps. So if we were to use the same size texture map for both of these polygons, this one, because it's a lot smaller in surface area, would be a lot more detailed. And smoothing sort of does the same, because it has less surface area. The amount of smoothing is less noticeable. And you can do this with every edge that you have that you want to sort of define more clearly. And I can actually show you what it would look like if I were to remove this edge real quick. So this is with the support edge and the smoothing preview turned on. And if I delete it, you can immediately see that it brings back those strange lighting artifacts, because Maya wants to smooth it out. So that's what you can do to sort of go in and define some of the edges that you want to have a bit harder. The other thing you can do is use the Crease Tool. So again, if we, for instance, take this edge over here, you can see that it's rendered a bit more clearly than the other edges in terms of the wireframe. So that tells me that I've creased this edge, and I can actually show you what it looks like if I uncrease it, and I'll show you as well where to find the Crease Tool, because that can be useful. So if you go to oops, that's not what I wanted. There we go. If you go up to Mesh Tools over here and just click the Crease Tool, you see that you get a pop-up that says select components and middle mouse drag. So if I now have this edge selected and I middle mouse drag, you can see that the amount of creasing that I do also changes the way this edge looks. If I totally uncrease it by dragging down, you can see that it sort of again it sort of just disappears into the rest of my geometry. And if I reselect it and I crease it all the way down, or up I should say, you can see that it becomes sharper. So this is again another thing you can try to get a better, sharper edge basically on your model. And if that doesn't work, you can go in and create some of these support lines. For instance, if we take a look at another one of my support lines over here, this one that I've placed is because if I didn't place a support edge over there, my cutting edge would basically be a lot less defined than with it or without it. So again, same application. This one down here is actually also a support edge, and if I delete that one, you'll see what it does to my to the underside of my axe. Not really what I was going for, this very sort of like bland, smoothed out look. So I placed a support edge over there, and you can see that it created a lot harder of an edge. And I also creased it, by the way. So that's what creasing does and what support edges are for. And you can do that for your entire model. Now let's take a look at how we can add some extra geometry to create extra detail. If we go down here, for instance, you can see that I created sort of like this leather wrapping texture or pattern. That's what I was looking for. This leather wrapping pattern. But this isn't on my regular handle. In fact, if I remove my high poly model right now and get my low poly handle out, you can see it's just a regular flat geometry. Because if I want to have that kind of detail on my model, I mean, technically I could export a model with this kind of geometry on it, but it wouldn't be very efficient, especially not in a game or in a game engine. This would suck up a lot of memory and a lot of computing power that's really unnecessary, because if you think about it, this is a part that's usually going to be hidden because it's held in the hand of a character or something, and then when you use a weapon, it's going to be swung around, so you're not going to be able to see that detail anyway. The only reason you would export a model with this kind of geometry is maybe because you want to showcase it in some other fashion in the game, sort of more like a hero piece. But that's not what we're going to be doing. So we're going to use this geometry to bake down as normals and use that normal map to get that detail on our model. So let me actually show you how I made this pattern real quick. So basically what I did is I started with a plane, and I made it a bit smaller. I think I made it 0.5 by 0.5 units. And then what you just do is, let's actually snap it onto the grid real quick, because that could come in handy. So if you hold down X, you can snap things to points on the grid, basically, which is very useful. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees, like so. And I'm just going to squash it in a little bit. Let me select my, let's see here, I want to select my world. So I just went down to the scale settings over here in my toolbox and set it from world to from object to world, because I want to scale this evenly. So I'm just going to do something like that. And what I basically now have created is one of these patches, but of course it's still a flat plane. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go in my channel box and I'm going to give it some extra divisions. Actually, that doesn't work. You have to do that before you scale it down. So I'm just going to give it 3 by 3 divisions, like so. And then I'm going to scale it down again, or squash it down, like so. And now what I want to do is I want to give it a bit more depth, basically. So I'm going to select my middle polygon, and I'm going to press B for soft selection, and I'm just going to drag up a little bit to give it a bit of that, what would you call it, a bit of the curve, so it actually looks like it's sort of like a round piece of cloth. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the outer perimeter, and I'm just going to hold down Shift and drag it down a little bit, like so, to create some extra geometry. And then I'm going to select the bottom edge and just squash it down a little bit as well, like so. And maybe just snap that up a little bit. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select these edges over here, and I'm going to bevel them a little bit. To make them look a bit nicer, a bit more rounded off. And that's basically going to be my patch. Actually, let me go back real quick because I think I want a bit more bevel. So I'm just going to drag this down a bit further and select the same edges again. And I'm going to bevel. Yeah, that looks better. Let's do something like that. That should be good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this thing a couple times by holding down Shift as well and just dragging it out. And then what I'll do now is I'll hold down D and V to snap my pivot point over to this vertex real quick. And then I'm going to hold down V to snap it together. So now they're sort of perfectly next to each other, and you can just do that by holding down you can hold down D to change the place where you want to place the pivot point, and by holding down V it snaps to vertices. So, and then you can just drag it around by holding down V and snap it together like so. And now what I can do, because I basically want to repeat my last command, I can just do Shift D a couple times, but that doesn't work, unfortunately. Well, let's just do it the old-fashioned way. I'm just going to snap them together again, like so. And now if I press Shift D, yeah, it should copy it a couple times. So I think I did like 6. So let's do 6 again. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these and I'm just going to combine them. So I'm going to select all of them, and then I'm going to go Shift right mouse button, and then where it says combine, I'm just going to combine them like so. So now of course we sort of basically what we've done here is we've created one of these patches, and we've created sort of like a circle or a flattened out pattern that's supposed to wrap around this entire handle, but it's not yet circular. It's not yet. It doesn't have this shape. So next thing we need to do is we basically need to use a deformer to tell Maya to wrap this around in a circle so we can fit it around our handle, and then we can go ahead from there and start creating some more of these patches. So I don't know if that made any sense, but I'll just show you how to do it. So I'm going to select my thing right here, and first I'm going to delete the history, so Alt-Shift-D to sort of clean up my scene a little bit, and I want to rotate it about 90 degrees like so. And then what I'm going to use is a bend deformer. So I think I already had one over here. I'm going to delete it real quick, so I don't want any conflicts to arise. So deformers are really cool tools within Maya that we haven't really used yet up until this point, but you can do a lot of cool stuff with them. And they're basically, they don't create any new geometry, but they warp around or literally deform your geometry in multiple ways. And you can also use deformers with several other cool inputs, like for instance a texture, or even like something like music or a waveform, or a spline, a curve, anything that sort of can be used to add extra information to a deformer. Yeah, it's really cool, but we're gonna use it on a basic, on a pretty basic level, so don't be too overwhelmed. I'm gonna show you how to do it. So let's go up to our top ribbon here, and we're gonna select Deform. Now you get a whole bunch of different tools here, but the only thing we're going to be concerned for right now is when we go to nonlinear over here, and then we're going to select Bend. Now when you select a bend deformer, like I just did, it basically places a volume. In this case it's not really a volume because it's a straight line, but most deformers are a volume, and it just places that within the scene without really considering what's around it. So you can sort of see this as an area in which the deformation takes place, and whatever geometry is in that area will get deformed. So because it's a 2D deformer, it's just a straight line, if we go to the properties of this deformer, so the attributes, and we start to drag on the curvature, you can see that it's not really working the way that we intended, right? Because it's just deforming in this way. And if we drag on it, you can see that it does something to our geometry, but not really the thing that we want. So what we're just going to do is we're going to select the deformer itself, and we're going to rotate it 90 degrees as well. So now it lines up with the geometry that we want to deform. And now if we drag on our curvature, you can see we get something like this, and it basically perfectly wraps around these patterns, these cubes, basically in a perfect circle. So that's really cool. And if we start to drag on our thing right here, you can now see that when we change the position, it actually changes the way it's deformed as well. And that's because, again, a deformer is just a volume within your scene, and if you drag on your geometry, it will just sort of change the way that it's deformed. You can do some pretty cool stuff with it. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna basically go delete our history again, so Alt-Shift-D, and that basically commits our deformation. And now we have just, again, a regular piece of geometry. And now what we can do is if we just drag one of these upwards a little bit, like so, and then rotate it. Whoops, before I do that I should probably center the pivot. So if I rotate it right now, it rotates around the wrong pivot because I want the pivot to be in the middle. So I'm just going to go up here in my modeling shelf, and I'm just going to click center pivot, and now I'll duplicate it upwards, and if I do that and rotate it a couple degrees and then fit it back down, now you can sort of see what we're going for. We're just trying to basically stack a whole bunch of these on top of each other until we have something that is large enough to envelop our entire handle over here. So I'm just gonna push it down a little bit, and now if I do Shift-D, that doesn't work unfortunately. So Shift-D is basically another version of repeat last command, but you have to do it sort of in one go. So I'm just gonna drag it up, rotate it, and I'm just gonna fit it down until it sort of sticks together like so, something like that. And I'm just going to do Shift-D a couple times in order to create enough of these things to wrap around our handle. And of course I already did that, so I don't have to create an entirely new handle, but I will show you one more step that you can use to basically fit it to this shape. Because if you've done something like me, you know, now you've got this pattern, but it's like perfectly circular and perfectly straight, and it's not gonna nicely fit around your handle. So the first thing we're gonna do is I'm just gonna combine all of these. So again, shift right mouse button and combine. There we go. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use another deformer to make sure that it sort of fits this handle right here. And let me actually show you how I did that. Delete the history again. I'm going to hide my high poly model again for a second. And I'm going to bring out my low poly handle, like so. And I'm going to make sure this is that's not what I wanted. I need to center it real quick so it aligns with my my handle the way I want to. There we go. So now I've got something like this, but like I said, it doesn't really align, or it doesn't really wrap around my handle nicely. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce another deformer, which is called an FFD, which is very useful. I use it a lot because it's basically a box that you put around your geometry, which with another set of subdivisions and points that you can drag on to deform your geometry in any way you want. And it's called a lattice. So if we go up to deform again and we select lattice, you can see we get something like this. And now if I hold down my right mouse button and I select lattice point, you can see that basically it's just a box around our geometry. And if we now start to drag on some of these vertices, you can see that it has an effect on our handle, on our leather wrap. So, of course, I'm going to do this a bit more precisely, so I'm going to just go into my side view real quick. And the first thing I want to do is give it a couple more divisions, because what you have to keep in mind is that each one of these vertices, or lattices as they are called, it doesn't really nicely deform the way you would hope to. It's sort of just very sharply starts to break your geometry. So we want to do it in steps so it's not that noticeable. So I'm just going to go from 5 divisions to 10, and that should be good. So now what I can do is I can just start to go in here, and I can start to let me actually start by squishing it down a little bit, because it's a little bit tall right now. So I'm just going to scale it down a little bit, like so. Maybe not so much, a little bit less, something like that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in here, and I'm going to start to rotate some of these so they sort of align with the natural flow of my model. Something like that. I'm just going to try to make them follow the curvature of my handle as closely as I can. There we go. So sort of halfway now, so I don't really have to rotate them anymore until we get to the top over here. Let me actually, no, I'll do it one by one. So rotate this, and I'm just basically looking at how this edge over here follows this edge over here, and the rest of my edges, so they sort of nicely align with each other. something like that. I'm just going to drag these over again a little bit, like so. Let's do something like that. So now you can see with a couple of these deformers, we can get a pretty cool result pretty quickly, because if you had to go in and model this all by hand, it would probably take you like a day. But by just duplicating some stuff and using a couple of deformers to basically get the result that we want to more quickly, we can speed up our workflow, and it still looks really good. So just tweaking this a little bit here and there, and that looks pretty good. Now let's go. Oops, I accidentally enabled keyframing. I don't want that. I'll fix that later on. Keyframing is something we use for animation. We're not going to do that now. So let's go back to our 3D view and see what that looks like. Now that starts to sort of look like what we want to. If we hide our FFD real quick, or our deformer, we can sort of see that we're starting to get the result that we want to, but it still doesn't really fit correctly. So the next thing I'm going to do is, because I know my handle has sort of the same width in this direction all along its length, I'm just going to grab my lattice again, and I'm just gonna sort of scale it outward a little bit, like so, until it starts to completely envelop my handle. And what I want to be careful is that I don't make it too large, basically. So when we start baking our normal details, we don't want our high poly and our low poly models to differ too much in terms of scale, because that can lead to some nasty artifacting here and there. So yeah, just be mindful of that. And let's see here. I think it's still a little bit. Let's do something like that. I think that should get us mostly there. You can see that our low poly geometry is still sort of sticking through here and there, but we could try and go in and sort of fix that manually a little bit. So just by dragging on some of these lattice points again, that looks pretty good. Now I will say I do think it's a bit large, but for demonstration purposes it's not that bad. So as you can see, now we're nearly there basically with our leather wrap. The last thing we want to do is sort of scale it a bit down in this axis, because right now it actually still doesn't really fully conform to the model the way we want to, and that's because my handle that I have underneath here, so I'll just hide this real quick, it changes in width. Basically it's a bit narrower on the top here than it is at the bottom, even though it's not very noticeable. So yeah, I'm just gonna keep continuing to tweak this a little bit so we can get the result that we want to. And at this point, that's pretty much what it comes down to, is just keep tweaking it and keep changing your lattice points to get the result that you're after. There's really not much more to it than that. It's just going in and scaling things up, scaling things down a little bit, dragging on some of these lattice points to get a more precise result. That looks pretty good. So I think because I did it a bit quickly now, I think I sort of overdid it with a couple of the patterns. So the groove is pretty deep. Looks more like a pine cone than really a leather wrap, but it's the same process. So you guys can go ahead and try some of this stuff out, and I would encourage experimenting with some of these deformers a little bit more as well. So yeah, that looks pretty nice. I'm gonna hide my lattice real quick. Okay, looks pretty cool. Okay, so now if you just want to commit this result that we have, we can just go Alt-Shift-D again, and it'll just get rid of the deformer, and this is now just baked in, and we have our geometry back. I would strongly advise though to make a copy first. So if you just duplicate this, it does the same thing. It commits it gets rid of the history and creates a duplication of your geometry without having to the need of the deformer, and then you can just hide your original mesh and sort of keep it there if you want to make any changes. So welcome back. Apologies for that awkward transition that I had to do there. I'm recording this part of the video after what you just saw. I realized that it's a bit messy and it's not really up to par for what I wanted for these videos, but yeah, unfortunately I still have a day job besides doing this, and sometimes it just doesn't really work out. So I'm still editing this all on my laptop and doing this on my laptop, so it's all taking a bit longer. Hopefully you'll still be able to get the information you need out of this video, so let's keep going. So just to sort of summarize what we've done so far, we've taken our model and we created a smoothing preview of it, and then we started adjusting that model so we could have a nice smoothing result by adding some support edges and some support lines. And then we transferred our smoothing result to polygons with the modify and then the convert smooth mesh preview to polygon option. And what you should have at this point is basically sort of like a high poly version of your model and a low poly version of your model. And the low poly version should really just be there to inform the shape, and every polygon on your low poly should be there to serve a purpose in terms of giving your model the shape that it needs. And then the high poly one is one that you can use to add some more detail. So as I showed, I created this handle pattern right here, which has far too many polygons to be used in a game model. So we're going to use this model, or its lighting information to be more accurate, to create a normal map. So let me show you how to get into that. So basically what you do is you want to have your low poly and your high poly model in the exact same place in your scene, and that what we're going to do is we're going to go up here to this drop down menu, which is probably on its default setting, which is modeling, and we're going to click it and shift it to rendering. And once we do that, we should get a different type of menu up here that says lighting shading, and when we click that, we should be able to see a option under the baking tab that says transfer maps. So go ahead and click that. Now what we're going to do here is we're basically going to use the lighting information of the polygons on our high poly model and transferring those to pixels, so that we can create a bitmap, a texture map that we can then use to project on our model. Now I will say that before you go and do this, you want to make sure that your low poly model is unwrapped. I've discussed most of that in the class, and if you're really running into problems with your unwrapping still, you can take a look at some of the previous videos, or take a look at some other tutorials on YouTube. But for now I want to focus on baking the normal map, because that's sort of the last step that we have to do within Maya before we go ahead and create some more textures. So with your low poly model selected, what you want to go ahead and do is open the transfer maps, and then you'll see a couple of things here. The first thing is the target mesh. Now the target mesh is the mesh that's going to be used to project the normal map on. And again, a normal map is this particular type of texture that can be used to add extra detail to your model. And below that you'll see source meshes, and the source mesh is going to be your high poly mesh. So I'm just going to select my high poly mesh and then click this button that says add selected. And then when we go further down, you'll see the output maps. There's a couple of different ones that we can bake out, but for now we're just going to focus on the normal map. I already did this process once, so let me just remove that so I can go through all the steps with you guys. So when you click normal map, you'll get this dialog right here, and the first thing we want to go ahead and do is select a destination for our texture. So it will probably default to some folder that you have within your project folder. So I'm just gonna browse to my project folder, and I'm gonna select the source images folder, and then I'm gonna name this file X normals. There we go. And then when we've done that, we can select the file format, and I'm just gonna go for PNG right now. Usually for game models and for game engines, they will go with something like a target file, but PNG is a bit easier to manipulate in Photoshop, so we're gonna stick with PNG for now. You can leave the rest of the settings as they are, and then we get to this drop-down menu which says connect output maps, and this will basically allow us to either create a new shader or assign the normal to the existing shader. Now usually when you create a new model and you don't change any of the shaders attached to it, it's probably best to create a new shader, and that's because whenever you start with a primitive in Maya, you start box modeling or poly modeling, all the primitives share that one material, that one shader. So by creating a new shader, we're actually making sure that our normal map isn't applied to all the objects in our scene, but just the ones that we want to have selected. So just go ahead and click new shader, or you can just choose to bypass that altogether and not create a new shader or not apply the texture to any existing shader by checking this box right here. And then down here in the Maya common output, we can also select a couple of things. Most important is probably the map size. So we've talked in the class about how texture maps work and what different map sizes do, and the thing you gotta keep in mind is that whenever you double your map size, so you want to go one step up in detail, you quadruple your file size, and that's of course because you're not just doubling it on one axis but on two axes, on the U and the V. So I set it to 2048, which is pretty high res, but it's not too much to ask. It's pretty standard for what they call hero props, or things that are really lit out in the game, that are really used a lot. For instance, maybe a gun, or in this case an axe that your character's holding very close to the camera. 2048 is usually fine. And then the other thing we can do is choose our sampling quality, which is just going to sort of sharpen up our final image. I have it set to medium, which is probably fine as well. Depending on what kind of machine you're doing this on, you can play around with these settings, either the map size or the sampling quality, in order to get a better result, or a quicker result, I should probably say, because sometimes it can really chug your machine down to a halt. So just keep that in mind. And then lastly, down here we have in the advanced option something called a search method, and you want to make sure this is set to inside envelope and then outside envelope. Now you might be wondering, what is this envelope thing, right? Well, we're not going to put anything in the middle, but when we go all the way back up to our transfer maps dialog, where it says target mesh, I should probably add my low poly. Hadn't done that yet. When you have your target mesh, there's an option where it says display, and when we select that to envelope, you'll see that we get this sort of like pinkish, reddish volume around our model. And basically what this represents the distance from your model at which Maya will start looking for that high poly lighting information of our high poly model, and where it'll then project that information onto your model. So for instance, you can imagine that a ray is coming in from this direction and it hits the envelope here. It starts searching for your high poly model, and when it finds it, then it commits that information and applies it to your low poly model. Now generally what you want to do is make sure that this isn't either too far removed or too close to your model, and the only way you can really find out what works for you is to sort of do this process a couple times and see what the results are. Because for instance, down here I have this edge, but if I were to set my envelope to large, you can see that well, if I make it very large, it actually starts clipping into itself, which is something you want to try to avoid as well. But also you can imagine that if two rays come from, for instance, over here and over here, they might intersect each other before they actually find any geometry. And that can be a problem, because that means that you'll get some strange looking baking artifacts, and we want to try to avoid that as much as we can. So what I usually try to do is I try to sort of set it to a distance where, well, it's not looking like this, because now my model is clipping through. But let me try something like 0.4, and actually that's a bit large. Let me set 0.2. Yeah, 0.2 is good. So I sort of want to see something that's akin to maybe, I wouldn't say shrink wrap, but maybe something packed in packing paper or something like that. Just that it's sort of thinly floating up on your model. And I can actually see that my model is sort of poking through over here, so I'm going to probably change to 0.3. And then it'll look like this. Now, one problem you might run into when you're doing this process is that you'll see whenever you try to mess around with your envelope, there are some areas where you want it tight, for instance on a ledge right here, and there are some areas where you want to have it a little bit loose. For instance here, my high poly model is still poking through the envelope. Now the beautiful thing about this envelope is actually that it's not just this sort of imaginary boundary, but it's actually an object within your scene. So if you fold open your low poly model, it should have a little plus to the left of it, and then click this envelope shape, you'll see that it's actually just sort of like a duplication of your low poly model. And now what we can do is we can just go in and start selecting some of these edges and start pulling them out a little bit, or scaling them a little bit in order to get a better result. And this is very useful because this means that you can sort of manually decide where you want your envelope to fit on different parts of your model. And it can be very useful, especially in cases like this where you have an envelope that looks, fine for the most part, but then there's one piece where it still sticks through. So yeah, I'm just gonna go in here and start fixing some of this stuff, and you guys can try this for yourself, and I'll see you in a minute. So I'm pretty satisfied with the way that's looking. Now that we're done creating our envelope and adjusting it, and we've done all the other things, let's go ahead and give this a bake. Now, like I said before, this can sometimes slow down your machine quite a lot, so just try it out, and if it, let's say, takes more than 50 minutes, just stop the process and adjust some of the settings and try it again, because we don't want to sit here for hours waiting for a single bake just to find out that it's not looking very good. So anyway, down here we can just go bake, and then Maya should do the rest. Okay, so my bake seems to be done. Now, as you can see, even though that we've now baked our geometry, which you can clearly see by the detail that we have on our handle, my model still looks a bit strange, as well as there are some artifacts here and there, so I might try to do another bake and fix some of that. But the other thing you might notice is that it seems to have some sort of weird color or something strange going on with the lighting. So let me actually show you how you can fix that. So I'm going to get rid of this window real quick, and I'm going to select my low poly model, which we've now baked the normal information up onto, and I'm going to go to the attribute editor, and I'm going to go to my Lambert material, which has my normal map on it. So you can see that right here where it says common material attributes, there's a little box for bump mapping, which is another name for normal mapping. Sometimes these terms are sort of used interchangeably, which can be a bit confusing, but just know that this is where we do our normal mapping. And you can see that it has a file attached to it called file 6, and then we have this little box to the right of it, so with the arrow in it, and when we click that, we now browse to the file options of that file that we have attached, which is our normal map. And when I bring up my if I were to bring up my files real quick, you can actually see that my source images now has this file called source x normals, and here you can see what our normal map looks like, but more on that later. What we're going to do for now in order to fix this issue is we're going to go to where let's see here, right, we're going to go to where it says color space. I had to search for it for a second. It's late. I'm recording this late at night. I apologize. Where it says color space, it currently is set to sRGB. We want to make sure that it's set to raw, because sRGB is not actually the color space that we use for normal mapping, as you may have seen in that picture that we just showed you, that I just showed you. So now we can see that it looks a lot better, and we have our model looking nicely detailed. Now again, you can see what I said earlier when it comes to baking. Sometimes you can get some of these artifacts, and getting rid of those is simply just a matter of sort of playing around with your envelope a little bit, or playing around with your settings in your baking menu. Let me actually see if we can actually do a better job of this now. So I'm just going to Ctrl-Z real quick and undo all our hard work, but that's okay because it's all in the name for improvement. So let me select my transfer maps window real quick. I think the first thing I'm going to try is change some of this to more closely fit my geometry. So I'm just going to select some of these edges over here. And the beautiful thing when you want to try to sort of fix some of these issues is it works exactly the same as selecting regular edges and regular vertices. So we can just go to vertices like so, select some of these vertices, and then see if we can maybe scale that down just a tad. See if that gets us a better result. I think the reason that it gave the artifact there is because the envelope is actually intersecting right here as well. So I'm not sure how much we can do about that, but the beautiful thing is that we can always go ahead, go into Photoshop and try to fix it over there. So yeah, it's getting a bit difficult to get this properly wrapped around without it poking through. I guess we'll have to settle for that. And then let me see if I can do something about, yeah, it's probably the same issue. So I'm just gonna go ahead and bake again and see if we get a better result. So I've just done a rebake, and the results aren't really that much better. But I think now would be a good time to jump to Photoshop and actually show you what we can do to either add to our existing normal map or clean up some of these baking issues that we're having. So I just opened Photoshop, and I already worked on some other stuff in this document, but don't worry about it, I'll get to that later. And as you can see, I just dragged in my normal map, and when we take a look at what we have here, now I'll actually pull up my unwrap real quick to sort of let you guys, give you guys an idea of what I'm looking at. So let me actually open my UV editor. So this is the unwrap of my axe that I have, and we're having some baking issues around this part right here and on the top here. And if I select those parts in my UV editor, I can actually see what it is that I have to fix. And I saw that we're also having some issues down here. So I have to focus on these three things right here. But there's a way to make this a little bit easier for us actually. So it can be quite hard to actually see what you're looking at when you start working like this. So what we can do, and this is something that will also help us create more textures for our model, if we can create a UV snapshot. And basically what this does is it takes a snapshot, an image of your current layout of your UVs, and converts it into a texture, just like your normal map. So we can do that by just opening up our UV editor, take a look at our unwrapped model, and then if we go to image, and where it says UV snapshot, we can basically take a picture of this, sort of in the same way that we've been doing. Again, you can see I already did this once. Created a PNG, browsed to a file where I wanted to export it as, and then decided how large I wanted to have it. I went for 4K because I thought it's always easier to scale down than scale up, especially when you're dealing with very fine lines like we have in our normal map, as you'll see in a minute. And then we can just hit apply, and it'll export a UV snapshot for us. And when we open that in Photoshop, it'll look something like this. Let me disable my normal map real quick. Now, when you import your UV snapshot, it might actually look more like this, and that can be a bit unclear. So what I always do, just by double clicking on it, on your layer with your UV snapshot, you can do a color overlay, and this sort of helps to make it pop a little bit more, makes it a bit easier to work with. And now when we enable that and lay it over our UV map, we get a much clearer image of what it is that we're actually looking at. So I noticed that we have some problems with our baking over here on the top of our model, and then also over here we have some artifacts going on, as well as I think it was this part right here on the top, or no, it was this part. Yeah, we have some issues going on over here as well, and we're gonna fix that. So the way I'm gonna approach this is I'm gonna first go to my normals, right click and say Rasterize Layer, and this will make it editable for us. And now when we go up here to let's see, we have the clone stamp tool, but let's try to use the spot healing brush tool first. Let's see what that does. Where is my mouse? There it is. And do something like that. And I can see it's not really giving the result that we're after, so let's try the regular healing brush tool. Select a color that we want to match and just try and do something like that. And I'd say it looks a little bit better, but not really that much better. Now I do want to make sure that I sort of keep the edges a bit intact, so I don't want to go too crazy. It looks good. Basically what this tool does is it takes a look at a certain selected part of our image. So we can do that by holding down Alt, and then you'll get this different cursor, and you just click anywhere, and whoops. When we do that, we can sort of start to heal the spots that we want to have looking nicer. So something like that. And let me just go in and just try to get rid of some of these colors a little bit more. Now, we already discussed how normal maps work in a previous class, so I'm not going to go over that right now. But it's not actually that important for this process either. Just know that whenever you have baking artifacts, you can go into Photoshop and start cleaning some of those up. Let's see if we can do the same up here. That actually looks a lot better. And I'm doing this not in one stroke, but I'm sort of going in and doing it in little pieces, because that assures that my cursor isn't going to go too far off of the color I want to pick. Because keep in mind that when you use this tool in Photoshop, basically what you're doing is you're selecting a certain piece of your image that you want to duplicate. So if I select this, for instance, and then I start dragging, you can see that my selection also changes. So just keep that in mind. And then the final thing I wanted to fix, I already did that one. Oh yeah, right, this one. So just gonna do the same over here. Let's see what we can do. It's actually not looking too bad. There we go. And now let's see if we export this. Yeah, let's do export as. I'm gonna go for 50% the size, because remember we scaled it up, so now it's back to 248. That should be fine. Export, and I'm just gonna go to normals, edit it. And I'm gonna go back into Maya, and I'm gonna select my edited normals. So I need to select a different file. You should still have this this attribute open if you didn't change anything. So I'm just gonna go to X normals. I don't think this is the right folder. I have to go to the regular images folder. No, that's not it either. Oh, that's the wrong folder altogether. I need to get the X folder, of course. Images, X normals, edited. Boom. Now again, I have to change the color space from sRGB to raw. And let's take a look. And now you can see that it looks a lot cleaner already. Yeah, it looks a lot better. We no longer have these artifacts going on over here. We still have some artifacts over here that we can take a look at later. But I think I'm gonna leave it for what it is right now. Because I want to show you guys some other stuff as well. But I'm gonna end this video right here and get it uploaded. So I hope, even though it's late, you know, better late than never, you guys still have some use for this. And then in the weekend I'm gonna try to pump out the texturing video where we're gonna take a look at how to create different textures besides normals for your model, and then do some basic lighting to finish this assignment. So again, my apologies for all the delays. I wasn't planning this either, but I just had to make do. I'll be home in the weekend, and then I'll have my regular computer, and hopefully I'll get everything done a bit quicker. So see you guys in the next one.